Me,
Yes, you.
let me just got it. Okay. Heavenly Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we thank you for this little book by Carter Hughes, who reminds us that we as Christians, we as humans, stand in a privileged position in covenant community with God and with one another. And we look forward to that throughout the cosmos for all. We thank you for Marty's work as he leads us through this, and as he builds upon it for future work, we ask your blessing. As we discuss it here today, and we ask for the light of your presence by the Holy Spirit to edify us and to how we might apply this material to edify one another and to honor you. We thank you so much. In Jesus' name, we pray it. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill. Good. Well, this is volume 8 of 12 in the 12 books that are in the series Theology and Science, the Frontiers of Knowledge. This one here, we go to far past frontiers of knowledge, the whole development of the history of Western culture. Hello, Bryden. Good. We've got
Hello.
New
two in
Zealand.
the Southern Hemisphere now, so that's good.
You're back from the Women's World Cup there, Bryden, being the water boy? As a matter of fact, I'm not. Well, that's good. Your team is out anyway, so mine's out too.
So one of the particular interesting features of this book is just that you have somebody who comes from the East who's writing. So there is a distinction of perspective that I found refreshing, just not to have another person who defaults to Western thought, though he did significant education in Western contexts. There is a capacity just to bring in voices and perspectives that I think are a little bit different than what we usually get. So to recognize that we have somebody looking through Chinese eyes, which I don't know that much about China in the 80s. I know that right now to be in China and do anything theological is quite dangerous. So things have gotten much more challenging. There was someone, where did I see them? Just a month or so ago, who was always at the Karl Barth conference, who was Chinese. And he said that there was a woman who teaches in one of their schools who the paper she was going to do for the conference they were doing, they'd taken out everything that had anything to do with theology or anything, but that there was something in her address or something about religious something, and they saw that and they pulled her papers and she lost her job.
Oh, my.
So I mean, it's that significant of a hint of anything is enough to bring down the chopping block, so to speak. So anyway, obviously there have been great Chinese thinkers, and T.F. Torrance acknowledged the value of what it is that Carter Yu brought to the table. The nutshell, this book explores the history of being and relating. And so, the nature of those words, ontology, and includes epistemology, but beyond that, koinonia. There's a variety of language that we might talk about what relating looks like that have led to the contractual, individualized world we have developed. And to say it in many ways, that is the state of the world, not only then, but today, even now, we'd say that a world of atomized people where our relationships are largely contractual, meaning fear-based. We have a sense that we have to agree upon things with a particular kind of threat for much of what it is that we do. To live in covenant relationships is largely a law sensibility, unless you grow up in a Christian tradition where you have a community of love where the word covenant makes sense. For many people who don't grow up in that, they hear the word covenant and they live in the states of what we call covenant communities, and it is contract. It's everything that manages how you can function in your property within the neighborhood within which you dwell. So the word covenant has significant problems, which of course James Torrance's work on covenant and contract is legendary just in the input of understanding Christianity that is truly grounded in God's covenanting love, that is the context for all that we do, including science, versus contract, which is the way that many people read the Bible. Conditional, if-thens, if we do this, then God will be something for us. Conditional, contractual, all those things. So this book reveals a hope of theological science to restore proper being in relation. This is consistent in some ways, or it's a good dialogue partner with John Zizilis's Being as Communion, which in many ways is building out of the nature of God's being as communion, but also the nature of the church and humanity, also having an existence that builds out of communion. In that, this book goes all the way back to Greek sources, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. It's an interesting dialogue to see how Greek thinking has no guarantee in terms of the outcome that might be there. You can get a theologian. Zizilis actually just died within the last few months. So a contemporary theologian who's building on something that's more along the lines of what the Torrances would want to be see as what Greek orthodoxy would look like today. So just to say that the roots are what they are with those people doesn't mean that it may not develop very different kinds of orchards with very different kinds of fruit that come from them. The context then, I'll read the little bit that's about him in Torrance's introduction, but to say he was a leading Chinese thinker, these are Torrance's word, in theology and science. He studies issues of the Christian faith in East and West, challenging problematic models of thought. So he's going to the source, the thinking source of it all. He finds the best resolve in a holistic model based on the Judeo-Christian tradition. So, very Torrancean in all of that. There is a resonance that you'll find in a number of books. The Christian Frame of Mind and other books will trace some similar kinds of roots to what it is that Torrance, or that Yu is doing here. So just to look briefly, to say there are 7 chapters in this book. It's a fairly long book. How much of the book did you get read, Bill?
It came in late, Marty. So yeah, I didn't get much. Your outline saved me. So I didn't. The book I ordered it late. It came in late. My bad.
No. There's nothing bad. It's just I want to be sensitive to and not ask you questions where you have not plowed before. So a fairly long introduction that just begins to introduce some of the purpose of the book. Chapter 1, dealing with spiritual problems of the West. So he's going to go into the heart of those kinds of things. Chapter 2, the erosion of the personal experience in the world. I'm expanding more to what is this process of erosion, and dealing a lot in this section with literary insights into how we can see that statements, books of great authors have given insight. It's almost like a geologist going through and taking rocks out and going, what era is this from, and what did it do to lend something to the geography of this place? I mean, he's doing this kind of mulling through the strata of a body of literature to give insight there. Chapter 3, the preliminary analysis of the problem. So the chapters 1 and 2 at some level are addressing the state of what he sees to be the issue, the problem, how we look at the world, and particularly getting at issues of what he goes on in chapter 4 to talk about being in itself, and the whole way that the understanding of being came to ultimately lead to a very individualistic way of functioning. Chapter 5, the social cultural implications of the perception of being in itself. So again, particularly starting with Descartes, which he didn't say that much about Kant in here, but to say, Descartes and Kant are the 2 classic icons of the development of the modern world around thinking, the separation from the world, the atomization or the individual that grows from that. Chapter 6, he moves into his hopeful kind of reconstruction. So being is being in communion in the biblical tradition. So he's going to give us insights as to how to build out of that. And then chapter 7, some socio-cultural implications of the biblical understanding. So getting at the whole way that science and theology relate to the nature of the church and what it means to serve both God and the world as those who live within the network of relations that God creates. So that's just a quick kind of overview of the major components and organization of the book as he outlined it. Now, some of you had the opportunity to read the introduction and chapter 1. So I just wanted to ask if anybody had any preliminary kinds of thoughts, responses, questions, or anything that sparked your interest or you wanted to make sure that we pursue as we go forward from what you have read so far.
He didn't quote from Torrance. He didn't cite Torrance quite as much as Fides did. Did you notice that a couple of times, maybe 3 times, cites Torrance?
Right. Fides did quote him a lot more. This book almost seemed to, well, it was more of a scientist view, whereas Fides was more of a pastoral correlation with Torrance's work. So they're playing out different parts in a sense of Torrance. And there were a couple of times in this book that he quotes McMurray, which of course is always of interest to me. So I noted that where he did that. So it's McMurray has similar kinds of insights in the work that he does. In his book, The Self as Agent, he takes off more from Kant and goes Kant and the Romantics and goes forward from there in the tracing of the individualized sense of what it means to go forward. Bryden, I see that hand.
Quote.
Yeah, I'm just wondering to what extent a lot of Chinese tradition tries to incorporate opposites, and he mentions this in the introduction. And I'm wondering whether that's another form of dualism and a trap that we might fall into, because it's not just the harmony, which is the use, which is the very Chinese way of resolving the dualities. Because in the end, it's not so much a dualism or a harmony, it's an eradication of evil that actually happens with the atonement. Right. And there's a real new creation. Yes, there's continuity with the old, but there's discontinuity as well. And I'm just wondering if we can tease that out a bit.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. Torrance would say, I don't want to go with dualism, but I do want to acknowledge duality, that there is a nature of the world of thought that is based on the world that is the physical world that we engage other persons, where we recognize I am myself and you are there and we are talking to one another. I don't want to absorb you into myself and I don't want to lose myself into you. So we'll need to maintain a respectful sense of being for each other, to value the distinctiveness and also the potential of the communion that we might share together. And so the nature of what that communion is, at some level, I think the title of the book, The Critique of Western Dualism and Individualism, is to say, if I see myself as complete without you, I have lost something that is too much. And to say that I have a relationship with you and value you as being you, that's what family systems would call differentiation in the Bowen tradition. Minuchin uses the word individuation, which individuation sounds like individual, but it is more of a respectful sense of I will be myself and I will allow you to be myself, and we will love and accept each other and grow who we are because of the respectful way that we are with one another. And so to say the Father loves the Son is in the Son is in the Father, the mutuality of perichoresis, the Father never stops being the Father, and the Father never stops loving the Son, each being particularly who they are, and they each love the Spirit, and the Spirit knows and searches the deep things of who they are. So I think that there is this place of arguing that we need to learn to not do one or many, as often is there in the Platonic thing, but calling Denton's book the one, the three, and the many brings in the need for seeing the capacity to be in relationship, the threeness of that and the mutuality of it overcomes what Denton is going to lay as the tendency we have to be all one or the other. So if you're in the Roman Catholic Church, all is one. If you're in the Protestant Church, everybody's on their individual journey. That's the many. And that would just be one example. Communism, all is one. Democracy, everybody gets a vote. So to say that there is a formatting that makes us, it's not the same dualism that you're talking about, but it may be somewhat related. So the nature of relationality is not, I mean, that's what Einstein discovered, right? We have to see everything that we are seeing everything, but we're seeing everything in a relationality that is truer to the nature of reality, and we will live more faithfully in the light of reality if we understand it in a relational and not in an atomistic, broken apart Newtonian kind of way of thinking. Am I speaking at all to your issue, Bryden?
Yes and no. For me, the word interdependence is vital.
Yes.
From Gunton and others, the specificity or the particularity or I translate his word, thisness.
Yes.
So that, yes, individuation in your psychological sense is vital, but the interdependence of an ecological system is life.
Yes.
And I think that the phrase that I'm looking for is not so much duality, but interdependence.
Yeah. And that does show
because because Marty, let's face it, yes, you convene us, and then suddenly somebody else takes over. And then we all have to listen to that somebody, like right now, and then somebody else chirps in. And there's this dynamic that is created by interdependence and specificity that differentiates among us, yes. But there is something else going on with the thisness, the business of the Father is not the Son and not the Spirit, etc., etc., etc. And what I'm after here is not a yin and a yang that just gets quietly, naturally harmonized, because that kind of stuff is just a dialectic in another form, Hegelian dialectic in another form. And I think we in the West now are muddled over what to do with that. Hence my insistence upon thisness and interdependence. Anyway, there we go.
Yeah, in section 7.3 on the handout, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, starting 5, in the beginning is the relation, being as readiness for relationship. Then we meaningfully act toward one another in an integrated life. Integrated is not quite the word you're looking for there. The inner penetration of our being is the web of relatedness. Now we're getting closer to what you're kind of looking for. Somewhere here, I think I did use the word interdependence because I like the word interdependence. When I talk about the Garden of Eden, would say the nature of Adam and Eve before the fall was one of dependence. They depended upon God as loving children. In the eating of the apple, they became independent and they became like teenagers. I'll do it myself. I'll live my life. See you later. And that in the act of faith, what it is that Jesus does in calling us to faith is to call us back into a life of interdependence. We can't go back to being dependent, and we can't continue as those who are independent of God and just take what God gives us and go do whatever on our own. But there is a sense that God gives us the freedom, the space to be fully ourselves and to show up and become more of who we are because we are in the context of a relationship with the one who loves us into growing, into being. And so we depend upon God, and God would say God depends upon us. He gives himself to us. This is what I call the mutuality of hospitality. We think of hospitality, there's a host and there's somebody who is the guest. But Jesus always shows up as the host who's the guest, and then he shows up as the guest who is also the host.
Yeah,
And,
I agree.
and that is
I
played
agree.
out with people like women who've been caught in the act of adultery and women who are washing his feet. And the way that Jesus takes away the power position and moves
Oh,
into
he's
this
frozen.
mutuality of respect
Yeah.
is.
Oh, sorry, we missed you.
You did? Okay. The way that Jesus moves us into the mutuality of respect in the way that he shows up with and for those who are often outcasts is part of this life of interdependence that even God himself gives himself to be both guest and host.
Yeah. I think what you also did just then is you moved into what some call a soft Irenaeus view of the fall, which is great. I mean, it's just that we have in many Christian circles in the Latin West, we have a hard Augustinian view of the fall, don't we? If I can use shorthand.
Yeah.
And I mean, the classic book is John Hick, and it's about 50 years old now,
Yeah.
where he puts the soft and the hard view of fall. And I think it's very interesting when we move out of the Latin West and an Augustinian hard view of the fall into a Greek or Eastern view of theosis, because that's far more what you were doing just a moment ago. Yeah. And I think we need to name these frameworks as being actually rather different. You know, I'm going through that book at the moment on Khalid Anatolis's thing on deification. It's a bit of a mouthful. I mean, maybe folk know it. I'll flag it. You know, I'll post it on the WhatsApp, on the Facebook page. I don't know if you know of it, folks. Who else has heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I don't have it.
I thought you
yeah.
I thought you
Sorry?
mentioned it. I thought you mentioned it once before on the Facebook. No,
I might have. You know, I mean, you know,
yeah.
Senility and old age, Bill, is catching us all up.
Tell me about it.
I will tell me about it. I will definitely repost it or post it or whatever, because I think it's an attempt to say to us Westerners, hey, folks, there is another Christian tradition that we need to kind of not incorporate, but at least address. Anyway, there we go. Enough. Thank you.
There was a sermon last week. The pastor was preaching on the Beatitude, blessed are the poor blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And the metaphor he used is that, we are bad. We are like a mirror that is broken. And, we can't see ourselves and we can't see God because of the mirror. Now, I haven't had this conversation with him yet, but I went away thinking, that's really an individual model. The mirror is me looking at myself. It's basically, and to say the word heart as it appears biblically is not so much the individual, it is our being in relation. So as God's holy and beloved people, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. Heart is our relational being, our interdependence, to use your word, within the community where we love one another as we have been loved. And so if we say, and this is what I want to say, we are actually still good as God creation, but we are cut off from God. And he used the word depravity in the way of we are bad, but to say the depravity is our knowledge of God. To what degree is that true? Completely. We do not in and of ourselves have a knowledge of God outside of God, making God's self known to us. And to what degree does God make himself known to us? He makes himself completely known in the person of Jesus. So we can say that the nature of what it is that you is getting at here is to say that we have lived with a sense of what is called depravity by Calvin and others, is what should be the normal human state. You should be cut off. You should do it yourself. Nobody, God or church or anybody, should tell you what to do. And that is the meaning of human existence. And so the ability to recognize how easily it creeps into the church, that we tend to think of the individual Christian life and all that. We've actually taken the move into a dualistic sense of me, myself, and I, the Holy Trinity, and my journey, and what it looks like for me to get right with God, as though God isn't the one who's doing the initiating work. And I think in the last two chapters to say that God is the one who did the foundation of our ability to be made right with God, and God acts. So our acknowledgement of what God is doing and to live into that is the hope of the restoration of our being and relation to the one who actually made us for himself and for one another in love. And that in that is the hope of humanity. But the deck is somewhat stacked. The storehouses are full with everything to feed the individualistic human being who consumes and lives for self. And even what we do often that we call acting in love is really just we love the other so that they will love us. Even that can be contractual, right?
One thing that I'm very fond of saying, when I was a school chaplain, was, excuse me, anybody here not know their parents? And of course, you'd get one or two adopted children and so on.
Yeah.
So that was always a train of thought. And then I said, okay, now none of you are 20 years of age yet. And they all looked at me, where's this guy going? I said, well, 20 years ago, who decided whether you were going to be or not be? Oh, now we know where we're going. This utter dependence now upon two other human beings to co-create, I want to use that word, this extraordinary creature who is destined for eternity. And then I said, there's something else. All of us, towards the end of our lives, are going to be rather dependent upon other people, because our bodies are going to break down and the wheelchair's got to be pushed by somebody else, and somebody else might even have to shower you. Yes, it's a great indignity, but it's true, etc., etc., etc. And these poor teenagers suddenly got slapped around the face with this reality that their world was not their world at all. And which was the point. I mean, it's brutal in one sense, harsh, if you like. But suddenly, the whole world of me, I, myself, and that lovely trinity you conjured up a moment ago. I love that. Thank you. I'll pinch that. There's the sense of, hey, look, none of us would exist if it weren't for two other people. Not just one other person, but two other people. Oh, boy. And to rub this home, is extraordinary. And this is why I find this whole gay business with children even more bizarre, because suddenly, artificial reproduction technology, that's not just one other peer person or two other people or whatever. It's thousands. I mean, a very good friend of mine is a professor, retired professor in Adelaide. I mean, he will tell you the technological backup involved in art is unbelievable. So it's a bizarre thing, and we can start very simply, I think. Anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, and we can only call things bizarre if we have a sense that they could be otherwise. And the nature of this book is to try and help us to have eyes to see the way that people perceive the world, and to suggest that the otherwise that would be the healthful way is what the biblical tradition is presenting to us. And we are basically blind to it. So to say, the series is Theology and Science at the Frontiers of Knowledge. sometimes you would think we're going into the wilderness, but this is a wilderness that we created. We've created the wilderness so that we can't see our way around. And we're having to come back to, we won't call it civilization, but we're coming back to the place from which the origin of what healthy beings comes from, which I almost want to use back to the garden there. We got to get ourselves back to the garden, but it's beyond the garden, but it has the intentionality of God of creating beings who are for himself, for one another, where love is the course of their life. And there's a sense of value and dignity of the world and animals and all these things, that there is a sense of the frontier that opens up there that is truly a God-drenched way of functioning and being. And so to say that the wasteland, to just quote one of the things that he looked at in this book, that the wasteland is a description of the modern world that has made the world a wilderness, right? Isaiah 35, the image of the wilderness becoming a garden, that in a sense is the outline of what this book is suggesting, is that the nature of humanity is that it has a wasteland sense to it by virtue of thinking of ourselves separate from one another. Therefore, we become malnourished, needing one another. We become those who can't be fed in our souls, the deepest part of who we are, much less the spirit of who we are as God's people. And so we become drenched and lost in that dryness. And when the highway of holiness comes in the wilderness, there is this blossoming, this blooming of all that was intended to be there, but it required the self-gift of God making it into what it is that only God can make. And there is the nature of holiness, with the whole holistic sense that Yu is arguing. This book is leading us to the wholeness of God, that God's holiness brings by virtue of the entering the web of relations with God and one another, for which we were made, and in which alone we can be healthy, whole beings in relation. To go right to the title of the book. Dwayne, I see your hand.
Yeah, Marty, I just want to pick up what you're saying as far as garden. That language is temple image bearing. That cosmic realm in which the mountain where God dwells, that's the reality, that it's a tripartite temple motif that's being picked up there in the garden. And once we leave that, it is the wilderness, because it's our own independence that's determined. Because when they left the garden, they didn't have to grow anything. The part of the curse for the man is you're going to have thorns and thistles. What's a thorn and a thistle? Well, then what's physical labor to plant the seed and wait for the harvest? These suckers need water. They need sunshine. But the temple motif is the reality that we have access to the divine. That's all part of the theosis process, that the image bearing, we're restored, because that whole idea is that it's an inversion against the pagan, where they build the temple and they create the image bearer and put the image in the temple, where no, it's God who builds the temple and he's there dwelling, but he also has an image bearer who's co-ruler, magistrate over his creation, and that he lets us be involved in the process of ruling his creation. He gave us dominion. Like, it's such an amazing thing that where we came from, you never know how we got where we're at from where we came from.
Well, it's been a long trek from the garden, right? The song, we plow the fields and scatter the good seed on the land, but it is fed and watered by God's almighty hand. I mean, there is a sense in which, particularly in Karl Barth's doctrine of providence, that God creates a world that has the freedom to be what it is, and he is the one who sustains even that freedom, so that even the provision of us having the ability to plant and to water and to grow, all those things, that is part of the accompaniment of God, of what God creates, so that it can freely be what it is, and that we would not be burdened by the loss of what it is to live in our sinful state, because he causes the rain not only to fall on the righteous, but on the unrighteous as well. He provides even for them. So there is a sense in which when you see that God is the one who waters and that God is the one who makes the seeds to do what they do, there is this sense of wonder and gratitude, collaboration. I think of communities that build barns together, and there is a sense of that is humanity acting out of God's goodness and provision, but bringing a human participation, an interdependence, to use Bryden's word there, that says we do better when we're aligned with what it is that God has intended all along. And that means to see and to recognize all God's doing and to see one another's needs and hopes and to find ways to lovingly support those things. And sometimes there's the discipline that says, what you're doing is going to damage yourself and others. Out of love, I want to steer you away from those things that are damaging all that. And that is to say that discipline is an act of the love of God and of the human. We had fathers who disciplined us for a while, and he disciplines us that we may share his holiness, which takes us back to Isaiah chapter 35. Therefore, set the limb that is out of place back in joint. That's what holiness looks like, as what follows from that right there in Hebrews 12. So to say that this book is an attempt to call us to a kind of holiness that isn't purifying our lives, it's to rediscover who we are as God's people, created to be open and for one another, interdependent, with our particularity, which I find myself often using the word particularity. I don't use the word individual hardly at all anymore. It's the particularity of persons. So I'm right with you there, Bryden.
Yeah. Yeah. Shoot.
Armando, go ahead.
No, let's see. Mark had his hand up way before me.
He did.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Mark.
Mark.
Okay,
go
I'll
ahead.
make it short, Armando. Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I wanted to just pick up one thought that Dwayne brought up, and that is that in the Garden of Eden, in the first few chapters of Genesis, there is a lot of temple language. So I guess we can understand the Garden of Eden as kind of a temple, or a forerunner of the temple. But then when we read John chapter 2, where Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days, we understand then that the temple is actually Jesus Christ, in whom God completely dwells. So we come to Jesus Christ to worship God. So this is, this kind of language is in John is picking up on that temple language from the Old Testament. And it's telling us the real reason for the temple. And it's a beautiful picture, it's a beautiful simile for who Jesus Christ is. He is the man in whom God fully dwells and to whom we must come to worship, his temple. So I just thought I would throw that in.
Yeah. And I mean, that vision is one ultimately of, abiding in me. I mean, the sense of abiding in Christ, the temple, it's not just a temporary visitation. It's not our once a week visitation, right? It is the daily nourishing of who we are, fed by the vine so that we produce the fruit that shows the richness and fullness of what it comes from being connected. And I think we could say that's all part of the garden and the temple motif as well. So I appreciate what it is that you are bringing out there, Mark. Thanks.
And also just to connect another dot there, where it says in First Peter, that we are the holy stones being built into this temple.
Yeah.
Yes, we are all being, built into Jesus Christ, so to say.
Excellent. Yes, and it's not our work. He's the one who's building that temple. So we give ourselves to be shaped and brought to be part of what it is that he's doing. Armando.
A few thoughts with regard to the reading and the very stimulating conversation. I think one of the most important things that I have discovered is the realization that nothing originates in me. But that everything originates in the relationship Father, Son, Spirit.
Right.
In the reading, they brought out the issue of the Western perspective, the Chinese perspective, the Indian perspective,
Right.
and the Chinese perspective being the mediator for amalgamating the two bookends. The problem with the three is that they don't have a consistent starting point. But if we have a consistent starting point in our divine family of origin, and that divine family is present, whether they be in living stones or dead stones, they're present. And so I said not too long ago to our beloved family of origin, I said, Papa, show me how I have been participating in the divine Trinity without me even knowing.
Yeah.
And the answer that came the next day was remembering an event that happened when I was 5 years old. The event was I spilled this glass of juice all over the table, and I got it all over my father. And his reaction was he flipped the dining room table. He called me a little pig. And that night, he brought a little table and 2 chairs, one for my sister and me, to eat in the kitchen. That next day, when I found out that I was going to eat in the kitchen, I took my little chair and I stuck it in the fence, climbed the fence, and jumped on the chair until I broke it. And the Lord says, you were participating in the Trinity without even knowing it. We were sending a message to your Father. That didn't originate in you.
It was a plea to be reseated at the table.
Yes. And that's the beauty about our Lord's redemptive work, in that he has restored our innocence before the fall. And as we embrace our restored innocence, our ability to trust the invisible presence of Father, Son, and Spirit in all is mind-blowing. Because there's no agenda.
Yeah.
Except theirs.
Yeah, well, you need to write a book about that.
I've been working on a book on the unholy Trinity that you mentioned, me, myself, and I.
Yes.
Because in looking at image and likeness, most of the reading that I have come across and looked at looks at spirit, soul, body as a constituency of parts. And I said, but that's quite a leap from the self-revelation of the image and likeness. It can't be parts, because if we're parts, parts don't have an intrapersonal dialogue, and we do. And so that's the piece I've been working on, brother. And
Well, may the
Just-
Spirit
just some
continue to
thoughts.
open you up. The whole idea that we actually take time to listen. There was one night I was praying, as I often do, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on a sinner like me. What do you have to say to me? And he gave me some ideas, and it's like, why do you give me these things to do? And he says, because you listen. Oh, okay. So just to recognize the value of listening. I mean, so to live in a listening stance means that you'll end up with a lot more if you listen than if you try and come up with things. That's the invitation into the interdependence, right?
Yes.
Right, and I see that hand up there.
It's a travesty after that story of the fence and the chair.
Hmm.
Just very quickly, Armando, I don't have a body. I am body. I don't have a soul. I am spirit, soul, body. I am. And for the last 4 years, my body's been giving me huge grief in the form of a very strange neurological problem with my feet. But that's boring. But no, it's not boring, because it's anyway. Another matter. The thing that I wanted to say was Michelangelo. There's a story in the book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, about Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, sorry, is a hero of mine. He takes this lump of marble, which everybody else has rejected because it's flawed, in inverted commas. And we all know the story, perhaps. He creates the David. And as you see the David in the Academy in Florence now, you walk past these incompleted statues, which are in the guidebook they call the captives. And here's the point. You've got to pick up a very big hammer and chisel to get rid of the marble that's making these beautiful statues captive. And the bigger the hammer, the bigger the mallet, the bigger the chisel, the bigger the block that's going to go flying. And finally, you get out the little sandpaper and you polish up, the Pieta or the Day, the Night, or whatever lovely statue that dear Michelangelo produces. And there's this translucent thing called marble. And that's God with us. We're a living stone where, sorry, mate, here comes the hammer and chisel. Pow! Because nothing else works. Sorry, we're so slow, so thick, so deaf listening. It's got to be almighty great hammer and a blow. And there are quite a few of them. But finally, this sort of image that is Marty and Armando and whatever. Oh, finally. So that's what you're going to be looking like. Well, yeah, maybe, there are a few more chips and hammers to go. But I love the story. I love it. And I first came across it aged 14 when I went to Florence, Firenze for the first time. Oh, bellissima, because what a metaphor of redemption and salvation and sanctification. So bless you for your story. Oh, man. Yes, we get invited back. Really? Yes. Yeah, and please take the lowest place, because then he might actually raise you up to a higher place. Thank you. Thank you for your story. What a 5-year-old image.
It is beautiful. It is. So yeah, the whole sense of participation. I mean, this is something that the word gets thrown around a lot, and we tend to think of it with us being good according to somebody's standards, but that it's just a discovery of what love does, right? And that's what you were discovering, is that you knew the place to be was to be honored and seated at the place that was your rightful place as a child. So yeah, there is the resistance to say God's no is always a function of his yes. He says yes, And sometimes in his yes, he says no to things that are destructive to us. And sometimes they're chairs that are supposed to take us away. So no, that's great. The nature of judgment, your father judged at some level there that you were inconvenient, right? And so that was for his own good. The judgment was for his own good and not for yours necessarily, though he might have argued it was for yours, but I think it's fairly easy to see that it was not. And so to say the nature of shame, blame, and guilt are all about judgments, and they're about judgments of being right. Shame is me being right about other people thinking I'm wrong. If you had lived within thinking, oh, I should be ashamed, I did do something wrong, I should just sit here in my shame, you would have agreed with your father's judgment that he was right and you were wrong. But shame was not allowed to be in you. The shame was, in a sense, washed away. Guilt is when you're right about yourself being wrong. If you had said, I did blow it, I'm wrong, I'm the problem, that would have been living with guilt for something you did that wouldn't have been appropriate either. It wasn't a true reflection. And blame is to find somebody else who's to blame, which includes your father. You didn't blame your father and stop him. You simply chose to act in a way that was consistent with judging yourself as loved and worthy of being back at the table, and act in getting out of the way that which was in the way, which was a restoration of relationship by virtue of place. So I think just to recognize how powerful that the emotions of shame, guilt, and blame play out in our stories, and they miss the dynamics, the relational dynamics that I think Yu is ultimately getting at here, because we don't see ourselves appropriately in what's missing in our being, in our showing up in loving ways towards one another. And we become self-protective, judging of others, judging of self, and that becomes problematic in the whole thing. Therefore, the cross stands as that which removes our shame, our guilt, and our blame, so that we are cleansed, our consciences are cleansed to serve a living God, right? So that the motive is the love of God that moves us forward. Dave, anyone else have anything else there before I move back to the paper? Are you good?
I have a
Yes,
question.
Paul. Yes.
The book by John Hick that addresses the soft and hard view of the fall, that's a new concept to me, and I'm just wondering the title.
We've lost Bryden. I'm not sure which book that would be.
Okay, that's all right.
But we'll try and find that out. Mark.
Marty, I know you've read Karl Barth a lot, and I haven't read as much, but from what I gather, he once said, that God took our human sin very seriously.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, so serious that he himself bears away the burden and the weight of our human sin in Jesus Christ. So this is, if I understand Barth correctly, he took a very hard view in one sense, because this is God acting on our behalf in our stead in Jesus. So I would say, from having read Barth, there is no soft view. There can only be a hard view, in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you read the perfections of God in CD 2:1, he talks about the holiness, the righteousness, all of these things that are God's ways of being, but that God answers those things. He doesn't, quote unquote, take it out on us. God steps in and does for us what we are unable to do, which is the corresponding. He has these pairs within that section. So the nature of Augustine had more of a sense of the sin nature, and that we had to do something to deal with that, or something had to be done to deal with that. The question that people often have is, okay, Jesus has died on his cross. It only kind of comes in effect if I have the right kind of faith or the right kind of obedience. The human conditioning comes in. And I think that would be something that might be labeled. This is just my perspective of what it might be. Yes, I'm a sinner, but I have the ability to act in a way that's not sinful. So I'll acknowledge I'm sinful, and I'll be better. That would be a soft view. But what you're saying about the hard view of Bart, that God is the only one who actually can and does completely deal with the completeness of what it means to be broken away from God, that is a complete and hard task that only God can fulfill. So again, the one maintains human potential, the other denies human potential. And I would say that the human thinking they can do something would be a soft view, and that God is absolutely required to do what is necessary. That would be a hard view. But that's a little bit of a guess. But I think I'm just affirming that what you're saying is most likely to be right with regard to if we're going to use those terms. Okay. So again, just looking some at just the nature of the introduction, there are these three cultures. The Western culture, which has tended to focus on material needs. We have tended to become a culture of materialism, consumerism. I mean, all those things continue to be a focus for how the economy works, what politics moves around, and in many ways, what the church focuses on. Are we meeting the material needs of people? The question of what spiritual needs are, genuine life transforming spiritual needs, not just, have you prayed the sinner's prayer and are you good to go for, heaven after you die? Which is not as completely, I think, as what the gospel wants to do for us. We have become very focused on human needs and the nature of how that need can be met by whatever the mechanisms within culture might be there. Bryden is back now, so we can ask him the question, Paul, that you asked, and that is, what is the book of John Hicks that you were referring to on hard and soft?
Apologies. Yes, my computer crashed, or the internet crashed.
We're just glad it wasn't you crashing.
John Hick is the author, and it's about evil. And I forget the exact title. It's on my shelves, blah, blah, blah. I can find it if you want, and again, post it. It's at least 40 years old, 50 years old. It was one of my undergraduate books in the 1970s. Very helpful, actually. That's John Hick when he's trying to be useful rather than polemical.
Okay. And can you in a sentence clarify the distinction that he makes between hard and soft?
Yes.
Within that?
He picks on Irenaeus as the soft fall guy, as saying fall is an educational process. Falling is an educational process. Okay. It's the means whereby we actually grow up. And you did it very well with, you're a baby, you're a child, you're a teenager, you're an adult, and you become interdependent, using my word. Yeah. So that's the soft fall. We're growing up into the creatures that we were always meant to be. Okay? Yeah. Whereas an Augustinian and he picks on Augustine, the hard fall is it's a mistake, it's terrible, it's a catastrophe, it's a deprivation of the worst kind. We are depraved. It's a hard fall. Sorry, folks. It's a Baptist view of the world. Whoa, bad boy. So hard fall is, and then of course you're faced with the problem. Well, did the fall catch God unawares? Are we always lost in Plan B? Literally Plan B or Plan F or Plan Z or Z. And I think that is the confusion that almost both models in one sense create. Because if it was always going to be the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, which I think is probably correct, and then you kind of go into Church Dogmatics 2:2, which I was reading recently while I'm, because I've acquired this crazy book by a crazy author.
Who's not listening?
What? Yeah, quite. And it is a bit of a problem for us humans to get behind the fall. And these are just two ideal types, two models, two ways of picking on Irenaeus on the one hand, Augustine on the other. He didn't even look at the Greeks really, but Irenaeus is perhaps Greek in that sense, Anyway, enough.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's evil and the God of love.
There we are.
Evil and the
That's
God of
it.
love.
Yeah, found it.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. So the nature of Western culture within a view that's being presented here has not only begun depraved of God, it has actually built its whole system of knowledge on building out of the independence of the human, the not willing to accept God's sense of truth at all, that the human is entirely responsible and able to gain knowledge of the world, and we don't really need God anymore. I mean, that is the developmental process that comes there. So he wants to show us how we got there at some level. So the nature of the material focus of Western culture, Chinese culture, he kind of builds around emotional needs within Chinese culture, which again, those are emotional needs I would think to belong, to deal with the chaos in the world. Confucianism, Taoism deal a lot with chaos of the world. Indian culture, he talks about negating to find perfection. So again, this is a human effort to become, to gain something that he sees as ways in a culture of becoming human beings where something is fulfilled in the face of something being wrong. So the point B within the introduction is that the self is agent, which is the title of John McMurray's first two books in the Form of the Personal. Humanity is the locus of being, which is why it's so important in this book that is talking about being and relation, that if we're going to deal with science and faith, we're going to deal particularly at the locus, and that is humanity, and humanity particularly as God's creation for his purposes, and not humanity in its independent, fractured, and distracted existence. The problem of naturalism is the nature of humans observing the world, seeing it merely as having an independent nature of its own, and denying God as the source of it all. So it is a reading off of the world as having its own being in its existence, with nothing that needs to be seen of God in it. And the human within that then becomes just a thing, an object. And there are many manifestations of how that looks like, some of them in the most tragic forms, where you reduce humans merely to objects. I'm thinking of slavery and other things where they're not deemed persons, they're just animals or less than that. So the thingifying of humans in Buber's terms is an I-it relationship. And not only is that who you have made an it losing its personhood, the I loses its personhood too in I-it relationship. You lose if you see other human beings less than what they are as persons. Confucianism and Taoism, the goal of the intimate closeness with all things as the goal of communion and becoming transparent. I think he's suggesting that there are some things within those traditions that are helpful. He doesn't critique them as much, so we don't get all of his critique of those. So anyway, I don't know enough about them other than that I always say Confucianism and Taoism really should be considered philosophies, not religions. If we think that they're religions, then there is a God concept within it. So to say just because something deals with human life, trying to find out how to get the best human life, it shouldn't be called a religion necessarily. If it doesn't have more overt form of deities within it. So Hinduism's got lots of gods. So I mean, that's, I think, rightly called a religion. Buddhism, there are different forms of Buddhism. Some have more God concepts than others. Of course, the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all, I think, are truly religion. Yeah, the question about nature religion, when nature becomes God, I get your point, and I think that would be interesting to work at. And what he calls mythology in these chapters, in some ways, is that reading the events of nature as that there are gods that cause these to happen. So yeah, when do we call it? Anyway, it is not the primary point of this work, but to recognize the word religion. I mean, there is a certain sense in which people will say we shouldn't call Christianity a religion because a religion is simply the human formalities that come, and it loses the dynamic of a personal relationship with the living God. So there's a distinguishing line that we might want to make there that is somewhat a similar distinction between what we make between humans and animals and all organic living things, which would include trees and amoeba and all that. To say that animals and humans are both living is certainly true, and that there are similarities between them, but there is a distinguishing feature of humans, which Karl Barth would say, not that we are bodies with souls and spirit, but that we are had by the Spirit. The Spirit has us, and that's what gives us the dynamic of personal relationship that makes us distinct from dogs and cows and all that, though some people's dogs are more personal for them than the humans that are around them. The nature of a tree doesn't have the dynamic of an animal that has the response ability that a dog or a cat or other animals might have. So just to say that there are levels of ways of thinking about God's created living beings, but the human is created specifically for relationship with God, and Christianity has a particular sense of that because of who Jesus is, that the Jew who doesn't acknowledge Jesus, Yahweh still has called and talked to. I mean, the question of, to what degree you say Judaism does have a sense of the same God. And of course, there's been a debate over the past decades of, is the God of Islam, is Allah the same God as Yahweh and Jesus? We're not going to have that debate here. But all of it to say is that it is possible for all forms of religiosity to fall within the critique of what it is that Yu is putting out here. And that is that humans often will use the realm of the religious and the spiritual to serve all of the individualizing, human empowered ways of beings that are problematic and don't submit to the living God known in the person of Jesus. So they all have a potential susceptibility to that, I think. Chapter 1, Observations on the Spiritual Problems of the West. So again, the self-awareness of spiritual cultural problems, people are generally not aware of it. I mean, there are people who talk about the language of I'm spiritual, not religious, that are distinguishing something about the nature of what is the problem, and is there a possibility of something that could be called spiritual that might be there, though what it is that they would do within that is not entirely clear. So the opening line of the 12 steps, to confess your brokenness to God as you conceive him, I think is the phrase there. Well, God as you conceive him is kind of Karl Barth's natural theology in a nutshell. I mean, it's who is this God? Well, it's God as you conceive him. Okay. That may or may not give some sense of orientation, that there is an other. I mean, it may break somebody out of just being entirely, I am for myself and by myself, there is no one, to even conceive that there could be a God may be a helpful move. It may be breaking out in the same way that getting married for some people actually breaks them out of being entirely self-absorbed. And if getting married doesn't do it, having kids usually will get somebody to recognize I can't just be for myself anymore. And so at some level, those are spiritual experiences simply by virtue of breaking out of the self-absorption that our culture kind of tends to call us to as the fulfillment of humanity. And so to say the spiritual problem of the West is the many forms of self-absorption, and that the nature of what has happened when we get technology and all that is just furthers the problem, because we have more power to make our lives satisfied without God or anybody else in many cases. And this whole sense of literary pessimism is what he's going to spend, much of a chapter just tracing out the ways that some of the great literary figures of the last, particularly the last century, but even a bit beyond that, have articulated the loss of the human having meaningfulness that comes from God. So in 1:1 there at the top of the next page, the sense of ambiguity in the realm of historical reflection. The sense of ambiguity at one level it's the loss of meaningfulness. It's the loss of the ability to recognize that we are persons who need one another. And so we just start living as though the world is a machine, feed the machine, do your work, get money, feed the machine, go on a vacation, feed the machine. The need to be connected with one another, which for many church was a social connection that did feed something, even if they didn't fully get what one would hope as spiritual growth in that context. But the failure in the field of action works in the field of relations. If everything is about actions, which the actions and acquisition through actions, if that replaces the field of relations, then we end up, the phrase he used several times, resting on the oars, in this case, resting on the oars of technology. So what is it we are using to get, quote unquote, the good life? And those are the oars that we are using. It's pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps is another phrase of that. So to be ambiguous about meaningfulness in life, to be ambiguous about God, is to leave ourselves at some level at a loss in the personal life, which he identifies as culture committing suicide. I think maybe you referred to somebody. I didn't give all the references. I was trying to trace the progression of thought here. So to say the world that we live in, particularly Western culture, tends to be blind to the loss of the personal life and the suicidal dimension that comes from that, the killing of the very thing that would vitalize us in the midst of it. And the breakdown of the humanities, a friend of mine teaches in the religious studies department at the University of Washington, and he said a couple of years ago that the humanities at the UW were the #1 recipient in the United States for funding, or for grants and funding in the humanities. It didn't even show up till about the third page of the paper that comes out from the University of Washington to note that that was the case. And he said it is a sign that our major universities are all about science and technology, developing things that the private business worlds will invest money in, and their success is on the acknowledgement of those monies, and the humanities have lost it. And he said, I don't even know if we'll be around here another decade or two. So that's just a symptom of the issue that is here. Parents show up and they say, you get my kid a education that will make them lots of money and live a successful life. He says, well, the religious studies department here, or the Jackson School of International Affairs, we can train your kid to be an ambassador, or whatever. No, we want them to be something that'll really make something of themselves. And it's all the language of the point that is the ambiguity towards a meaningful life here, where money is meaning, but it's a meaningless meaning. It just means I can get a position, some kind of recognition, resources, but without any sense of a real engagement in something that's meaningful from what we would call the life for which we were made to love and be loved, particularly from God, but also in our human relationships. So again, he ends the chapter just talking about the predicament of modern literature, tracing people who have written great books on the breakdown. It's supposed to be Eliot, not Elioi. Spare in the Wasteland, the breakdown of the liberal humanism in Autumn, the crisis of freedom and the turn to barbarism, the spiritual predicament. His point in all these things is that the artists, i.e. the writers, have a lot more insight into the truthfulness of what's going on than the scientists do. And that science, in a sense, has become blind because it's become a tool of technology and politics and all that, which it's not totally unlike Micah Polanyi the day he woke up as a scientist and found all he was supposed to do as a scientist was to produce things that would meet the needs of the communist rulers with the machinery of war and production. And he just said, this is no longer science. I'm just a tool of the state. And so he left Hungary and went to England at that point. But so he was, a great philosopher of the personal, who lived in exactly the predicament that's being listed here. Polanyi does show up at the very end of the book. He could have been used more in what was going on. Chapter 2, the erosion of the personal. Erosion, if you think about erosion, there's something that wears away at something that was there that was good. The earth has lots of nutrients and you put seeds in it, it grows. But when the erosion takes over, it takes away the nutrients and something is left that is less than capable to sustain that which would have flourished there had it been sustained. So the erosion of the realm, the personal realm of being, which again, one of the books that I'm working on in the big picture is The Science of the Personal, the indwelling, expanding the methodology of T.F. Torrance, is to say science largely today thinks that it can only deal with the world of the impersonal. And that is part of the erosion of the personal, is we don't even know how to pay attention to it. And people often say, well, just a minute, there's psychology and sociology. That's the science of the personal, isn't it? It's like psychology assumes the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the individual. And we call those, cognitive therapy and emotive therapy, but it's dealing with the individual. If you read the diagnostic manual, even DSM-5, it doesn't include categories that deal with the nature of human relationships, much less people who are having spiritual crises. It's just, it's non-existent. And so that is all to say, that is a manifestation of the problem of the erosion, that we don't even have the capability to recognize that even our sciences that deal, quote unquote, with humans don't really deal with them as persons. And occasionally I'll see an advertisement in a hospital. We do person care, not just health care. And they're attempting to say, we see you as a person, not just a body. And so, we're hoping that the bedside manner and all that will be better, but do they really understand what it would mean to really treat that person as a person? They understand the impact on family and all of this person and the crises that are brought to the fore by virtue of what's going on in this person's illness or the tragedy of the moment. So the human person, and he talks about these three things in the whole of the rest of the chapter, the meaning of existence, the identity of the self, and meaningful human relations. These are the things around which he thinks that the loss has come. So to say that in the modern world there's been erosion of meaning, he looks at Kafka and the experience of meaninglessness, the absurd, cut off from our roots. I wonder to what degree the whole issue around people of different backgrounds, if there will be a revival. I had a couple students in a class once at Seattle University say, we don't want you to call us Black Americans or Black, Afrikaners or anything like that. We want you to ask us about our story. And there was a sense of their personal identity. They didn't want to be given just another label and not the old derogatory ones. They all at some level unrooted them from who they saw themselves to be and the story of their family lives. And so it's interesting later on that he's going to propose that Christianity lives the story. The gospel is a story. The Bible tells the story, and to remember is to remember ourselves within that story. So to see the Bible not as a story about someone else, someone far away, but to say, this is my family story. I'm part of this family, is a remembering of something that we didn't even know that we were part of that story. And the suggestion here is that the erosion of the West is that we don't even remember that. I think it was Aldous Huxley who wanted people to continue to read the Bible, even though he didn't believe it, because he felt it was so important for Western culture to remember what it is that the Bible brought to the stage, the language it provided, the thinking about what it means to live in cultures and deal with issues. So to say, as many of the professors who I teach with, there is a biblical illiteracy, not just amongst the people outside the church, but even sitting inside the church, and often the kids of pastors that sit in our biblical studies classes know nothing about the Bible. They've lost the story. They've lost the sense that this is their story. And being a Christian means making a commitment at a point in time. It's a very individualistic. I decided, I got baptized, I told people I was being converted, I'm on my spiritual journey. It's all just the language of the individual. Instead of, I found myself within the story of the one who came, who loves me, who I walk with every day, who I listen to, who guides me with wisdom and compassion to be that for others. I mean, and there's the living in the story. So to say the erosion of the meaning of existence is that we don't even know the story that would give us meaning. And therefore we are left with this sense of absurdity, cut off from our roots. And that's how Yu is using the word, I think. So this religiousness and the idolatry of the sensible, which I think is just whatever it is that pleases my senses, that's what I will pursue. Wine, women, and song, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These are the language of the idols of the sensible. And God made all those things. God made medicine, and he made sex, and he made music. It's just when they're abused and become idols that they become problematic. And so that's part of the confusion of, how do we learn to honor what it is that God makes and live appropriately with it and not abuse it, so that they become the idols of our life and become part of the erosion of our existence, and have a culture built merely in the pursuit of the experience and not the giver of gifts. So we end up with pseudo-reality and emptiness behind our sheer existence. We know that existence is real, but everybody's just told your truth is your own truth. Don't take on anybody else's truth. And it all leads just to the breakdown. So the phrase things fall apart. We live in a world of impersonal anarchy, which is the last verse in the book of Judges, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, is an apt metaphor of that impersonal anarchy where there is an individualizing that loses touch with the other. A world where reflection on language takes the place of language itself, which is kind of like people talking about the Bible all the time, but never actually asking, who is this God that's being talked about here? We've got the arguments down, we've got the verses memorized, but have we actually heard the voice of the shepherd? And do we have a sense that we are known, loved, supported, that we are looked for when we are the lost sheep, that we are not abandoned? All of those things, that would be part of what the fulfillment of where we're not just talking about the Bible and talking about God, or as I say to my students often on the first day of class, now this is a class on theology, which many people will translate talk about God, logos, theos. But in this class, we're going to try and see if we can let God talk. Let God talk means the person of God shows up and begins to speak to us. And so we develop a dynamic of hearing and responding. That's the field of the personal. So 2.2, the experience of fragmentary personal identity. once we see ourselves lost in a world where we're by ourselves, the universe becomes hostile against us. The looking over your shoulder for others' reactions. We lose our sense of our center. We're just concerned about what other people think, right? This is also the definition of a codependent. A codependent is somebody who only cares what other people think. A people pleaser is another name for that. All they care about is what other people will approve in them. They've lost their ability to be themselves in the context of the relationship. Hence, they've lost the interdependence that Bryden was mentioning earlier. So a scattered world without a center, hollow people, bouncing, balloons bouncing around in a sense and bumping into each other, but no sense of the interdependence, of the beauty of the woven togetherness. Paul's phrase that your hearts may be knitted together in Colossians, I think, is that beautiful image of that woven togetherness of a people. Lost in an ocean of random facts and information, which one author called a comedy of information. And at some level, we're laughing at ourselves. We're laughing that we've become so fooled to think that facts and information are what we really need. They say we have more information in our cell phones than filled the great library of Alexandria. But the information doesn't give us wisdom. It doesn't give us a sense of knowing and being known. It doesn't give us what we need to be fulfilled as persons in relation. Information by itself has a kind of unrootedness as well. It's not connected to life. The experience of the failure of meaningful relations, so to say, in the face of this depersonalized world, there is an alienation and a cosmic loneliness. I'm alone. I'm alienated from nature at some level. I move inward to find myself, to escape the darkness and the fear of others. I have no story. I just have an experience. And the failure of communication is a failure of relationships. I've often said, we talk about the 3 R's: reading, writing, and relationship, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. But I've never heard, a proposal for the 4th R, which is relationships, which would begin really by talking about communication. What's your name? What do you like? What are you feeling right now? I mean, you could do that with a 5-year-old. If you don't have a language for it, look at this picture. What do you think these kids are feeling about each other? Well, if there's a bear there that's going to get them, they're probably afraid. Good. Fear in the face of something that's going to get you is a good word to have. Remember that word. You may need to use it just to learn the language of emotions, to say those words out loud. If we started with kids at kindergarten, 5 years old, I would hope that if you worked at it, by the time they graduated from high school, they would be competent at negotiating, at making requests of what they need and helping others to find agreements to work with them. They'd be able to communicate to employers and employees how we can be a team together. I mean, there's so much that could happen if there was a class. I've never seen a class that did this. There are some classes that have words on the wall like kindness and helping, but I think it's an accessory, momentary thing instead of core curriculum. What does it mean to communicate and interface our lives so that we can speak a language together where we know and are known? Did you want to say something, Paul?
I wonder if any of you know about the game of Ultimate. Do you know that game?
I don't think I do.
It's short for Ultimate Frisbee. It's a game that's developed among young people and on campuses and in regions. And you have 2 teams, somewhat like soccer, somewhat like basketball. You can't run with it, and their goals. But what's distinctive about it is that there are no referees. And there is, and so there are rules, important rules that keep the game going. But you have to work it out yourself. And the game is very fast. And it's fast because you have to stop. People know what the rules are and they work it out. At the end of the game, the two teams sit around in a big circle and they talk about the really good plays they saw someone on the other team. They call those people out and say, I really like that, what you did in the second quarter. And my grandson, who's graduating from high school, or has graduated from high school this summer, has been on a team like that for 7 years. And the interpersonal relationships that develop and the negotiation gifts are developed. Totally a different game than a game with referees who have power, power to throw you out or give you a yellow card or whatever it is. So
That was a beautiful image.
That's sort of a spontaneous kind of development. It's been around for 10 or 12 years at least, but it's now forming into semi-professional leagues. And that sort of thing. I just
No, I appreciate that a lot. The sense of the others who are with you and the valuing of the dynamic and the utilization of language and skills and affirmation that are learned on the field, so to speak, is all, it's, I think, pointing to what's being pointed out as missing here and saying there are ways we can play and get to this, which Hunzinger wrote a book called Homo Ludens, saying that we are playful at nature. As children, we learn through play, and then we get the play taken out of us. The word ludens, as in interlude, postlude, prelude, is to play. That we need to sustain our playing in life to be able to really be successful in the interplay of our relationships. And what you just gave was a beautiful picture of the possibility of that. And I think that the ability to think of, what would the church look like if it had that kind of play, which is not a dishonoring or it is not a reducing of what church is to be. It's actually raising it to say that the interplay of our lives matters, and we need to do it without fear, which is what playfulness generally takes away, and what much schooling does. Be careful of what people think. Be sure you get this right, because if you get it wrong, what people will think. That's all the downloading of fear. So to sustain what your grandson is getting, a playful environment of learning and working together with affirmation at its core is it's a wonderful distinction. Bryden, I think you had your hand up first, and then Dwayne will get you after that.
Thank you. It's a question of Paul to Paul.
Good.
So you described at the end of the game, the two teams sit down in one circle. So I'm kind of getting an image where there is a period of competition, indeed real struggle.
Yeah.
But at the end of that competition, something happens that's very, very different. And it strikes me that is one of the keys to what's going on. Not only is there no referee, but the players critique by to pick up Marty's word, by affirming, by picking out what was fabulous, what was clever, what was creative, or whatever else. So the competition suddenly becomes something totally different.
Yes.
It becomes an enhancement, an enrichment, so that next time everybody plays, they can remember the good plays.
Yes.
Am I right in what I'm
right
hearing
there?
here?
And let me emphasize, there's a winning team and a losing team. I mean, of course. There's no, you get points for participating. It's winning or losing. That's really important. But then you sit down, and I imagine, because they know what the liturgy is, that end of game experience reflects back on the game itself, because that's in your head. But it's a remarkable thing to see.
Well, picking up on your word liturgy, amen to that word, because liturgia is the work of the people.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean, let's be really technical here. And sorry, you know, we're the priests. Where are the priests in the middle of this? Oh, we can go a long way here. The interesting thing is that next time they play, yes, there's still a competition, but presumably 7 years later, I think is what you said.
Yes.
Your grandson has a liturgical tradition now.
Yes.
And I'm going, wow.
Mhm.
Wow. Imagine, sorry, pastors, priests, and everybody else, coming to church with a liturgical tradition, which 10 years later, 50 years later, what does it do to parish life? Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Armando blew me with his chair. You've now blown me with your ultimate frisbee. And I'm going, okay, game over. I think I've had enough. I'm suffering indigestion here.
Oh,
Thank
and
you all so much.
one other thing that it goes along with that. Each team has a person that is the spirit director. I mean, not Holy Spirit, but spirit director. Those two people, if things start to get out of hand, those two people come together, those two boys, and talk about what's happened, and then go back and so there is that leader.
So there's conflict resolution, you're saying?
Yes.
Beautiful.
Or something's getting, and there's a coach as well on the sidelines, but it's mainly boy and girl.
Oh, yeah.
They're mixed teams. Also in that.
I'll have to study up on this more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It sounds like a book to be written there as well. Now, Dwayne, you took your hand down. I wanted to make sure that you had opportunity.
We actually had Ultimate Frisbee there at 20 some years ago or more in UBC. Region had some Ultimate Frisbee teams but I wanted to draw this connection. See, this is what I'm after. Again, where we all participate. Could it be that the Lord's table, and we talked about how guest, host, guest, this interplay and dynamic, the Lord's Supper is the game. We participate when we know we're not here because we're worthy. We're here because we're unworthy, but we got to do it in a worthy manner. We understand and participate in the symbolic acts that are pointing to the reality of this theology of this man who gave himself for us. Now we live in this welcome others the way we've been welcomed. This theology. And then discuss. We're not transmitting the information, because this theology is not information. It's a participation in a reality where we have to learn to love one another as we are loved. The more you love, the more you're forgiven. The more you're able to love, the more you love, the more you realize you're forgiven. And part of the process, what Armando is saying, I realize that everything is ascribed. It's not achieved. Everything is given to you. All these opportunities are given to you, and you develop these skills and these experiences, whatever like that. But God already knows. He's going to see whether you're going to act on it and bring something new into reality. And it's like the rediscovery of something that's been there the whole time. And then you go to yourself, well, shoot, I could have been doing this for all these years, but I have my own bias, my own prejudice, my unwillingness to go outside myself, or fear or shame, or I don't want to hear. Where you're being invited, and that's what Eugene Peterson taught me, that it's work, worship, and play. And the dinner party is where we play, where after the worship, what did we learn? How can we help each other put this into practice? How do we not let these ideas, not information, but ideas, not let them die? And I like the way you put remember. Like, I've got to go back and look what that prefix means for and member, because you got to remember yourself together with everybody every time you come to the table, and these are the people you're commanded to love as I have loved you. That last night when he's washing their feet, and it's a kingdom of servants and hospitality. Like, it's powerful stuff.
Amen. Okay, Armando, over to you.
Yeah, the image of church and our coming together was exactly what came to me as Paul shared the game. And the reason for meeting becomes crucial because we, as the people of God, should meet often, but not to go and sit and to listen to a lecture or sing a couple of songs under the direction of another, but to come together to experience the one who lives in us and is in our midst so that we can reflect them to the community.
Yeah.
But if we're not experiencing him in our midst, who are we going to reflect? And so the whole issue of liturgy that you brought up, Brian, was just gorgeous because each of us during the course of the week has been living out a liturgy. And we come together to share out of that experiential dynamic of the one who's closer to us than a brother and what our week was like and the magnification that occurs in that sharing is the maintaining of the unity that already is. Anyway.
Yeah, good.
Can I say that church architecture and furniture shouts a theology?
Yes.
Whether it's pews or whether it's pulpits or whether it's the elders at the top of the table around the thing. I mean, for me, it starts there.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill, we build our buildings build us. Well, our church architecture builds what we become.
Yeah.
And I mean, pews are a pain. Pews are a pain. Because the back of your head, Armando, is not much good to me.
It might be.
Well, no, mate.
Murray Ray is, I get your point. Murray Ray has written on
Sorry.
architecture and theology. I mean, yes, there are people who are exploring this because it's so important. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, help.
Yeah. I had one class that I taught once on the spirituality of Christian worship. In every class, I asked them to rearrange the furniture that day to express a different theology. So, I mean, we did circles, we did cross, we did squares, we did facing each other. But just to ask the question that you're asking, what difference does it make how we just arrange the furniture to experience one another in this space and talk about worship? And it's quite a exercise. Yeah. So I'm going to press on a little bit here for our final 11 minutes.
Yeah.
So chapter 3, the analysis of the problem. Again, this is all about the eyes to see, and he brings in this movement over time of losing the person by virtue of objectifying everything, reducing everything to an object, and dividing the thinking subject and reality from itself. This is the beginning of the dualism, and that the human ends up left with himself, encountering himself, and the self becomes the self in words internally, and we become abstracted from the world and left to ourselves. And again, he's been building on Greek notions that are here, which he continues with that in chapter 4, the concept of being as being in itself in the Western tradition. So this is the separation of the person from the world, from our thoughts, from what's going on, beginning initially with this idea that if you think gods are causing everything to happen, that's mythology. So the rain that falls, the volcanoes that blow, everything is seen to have this cause behind it. And so to separate the physical out was, in a sense, a beginning of science, is just looking at objects as objects. And so there was an advance there by removing the projected mythology onto it and getting to what it is to see things in themselves. But this was the seed of individualism as well, the mechanization that everything is part of a machine, just part of the objective part of the world and in and of itself. So it begins this whole sense of the big picture of ourselves experiencing the world, where I sense myself and my thinking and the world out there, everything reduced to being one or the other. That is the dualism, not the duality that takes over the cosmology, the view of the world itself split into two realms, which he doesn't talk about it much here, but being in itself, noumena, this is Kant, and as I experience it, phenomena. And then we only can deal with the phenomena. So we lose touch with reality at some level. It can only deal with the phenomena of things. Is again a further part of this that he doesn't express here, but is again part of the concept. He then takes time to talk through Plato, Aristotle, the whole sense of Plato with the idea of the realm of perfect ideas, which is, it tends to be the internalizing sense, whereas Aristotle went with the categorizing, the classification of all things. And again, this is what Thomas Aquinas is going to build on, because the logic, the massive project of being able to identify and classify everything gives a lot of sense of management of reality. But you've made it something that is given a kind of reality by virtue of our mastery over it. And so the whole question about the world as separate and mastered, and we are the masters who see ourselves as, in a sense, individuals, pilots at the helm, so to speak. And then he takes us all the way into Descartes, who again just takes us to an ultimate, my very being is in my thinking. I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which of course Karl Barth's revision of that, cogitor ergo sum, I am thought of, therefore I am, which is the reorientation that because of who God is as the one who thinks of me, I have my being. So again, separation or inclusion, interpenetration or separation, that is the battle that is being waged as we go over these centuries and the thread of thought. Chapter 5 then, the socio-cultural implications of the perception of being as being in itself, the erosion of the personal in a closed universe of inert masses and atomistic egos. So once we depersonalize that the universe isn't personal, we are in ourself become impersonal. We become an object, even in a sense, to ourself. Our thinking feels like it's personal, but it's an atomized. It's just me, and I don't ask the question, how do I come to know this other person? And do I care what they think about me, or do I just need to wear the mask, which is, of course, what the word persona originally meant. That comes from the Greek persona, the mask that I wear. I'll just wear a mask all the time and let people relate to my mask. So all of the ways that we portray ourselves, the facade of the person that ends up being somebody who has, I mean, the ultimate expression is a Facebook that has nothing to do with them, but it's everything about what I think people would approve of and would come here and visit. That's living detached from reality and living entirely into the facade. Perception becomes reality, right? And if you can get somebody to perceive something, then as long as they give you what you want, that is enough. So again, he's going to articulate this as the depersonalization and the desacralization of man, to not make us sacred, to not be personal. We have been reduced to objects in a mechanistic world, fragmented from one another. Our body is just a body, part of the world as it is. Don't talk about love. Don't talk about the nature of emotions. We can't talk about that. That's not real. I mean, even the church in many ways has lost the capacity to appropriately deal with the nature of emotions as something which we should deal with. Never mind, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, as though it's maybe something we're supposed to do with all of us. Oh well. So this atomistic ego subject creates a contractual society. We need to manage each other in this society. It's the referee on call all the time. We're not going to work it out together. We're going to live with rules and regulation and people to manage those. So we're always afraid of getting in trouble and getting caught and having to pay for our mistakes. So a whole society becomes lived, as I call it, we live 6 inches away from one another in apartments. right? He didn't use this language, but an apartment is, they're right next to each other. You can
But
hear them
they're
through the
apart.
walls, but we are apart from one another. And in many ways, our brains and our bodies become apartments. We're sitting next to people. We can hear that there's something going on there, but we don't really penetrate beyond the wall of the facade that we create. And this has become the accepted nature of the modern world. Where do you work? What kind of car do you drive? What do you do for fun? They all, in a sense, become decoys to really getting at the deeper interpersonal life of who we might be. Chapter 6, then, on to being as communion in the biblical tradition. This is the viable option for a cultural reconstruction. So what is the call? Regain the story and our place within it. Learn the story of the God who comes, who is with us, who comes that we might experience the nature of who he is, that in and through the knowing and being known, the communion that comes through communication, there is a sense of our identity being regained. Who we are is those who know that we have an Abba and we cry out, Abba, Father, but in the same moment, we are confessing that we are a child, that we are connected. It's the reestablishment of meaning. I am a child who's connected to this one who gives me meaning and purpose in my life. And in discovering that, we become covenant people. And the covenant means I am a person within the covenant relation. I am valued here. I am known. I am bonded to by one who has promised to care for me, to know me, to walk with me, to open my being both to who God is, but to the others around me as well. And in the space of environment where fear is removed, I don't have to hide and they don't have to hide. Adam, what are you doing there? I was hiding. How come? I was afraid. It's the turn of the fall to be invited to see the love, the acceptance, the space within which God allows us to be open to who God is. That God doesn't come condemning. He tells the truth and he deals with that truth in his love to reconcile, redeem, and bring us home. So the whole nature of the communing way of our being is the vision of creation being seen in its interrelatedness and our humanity within that in its interrelatedness, and that God is the one who holds it all together in its interrelatedness, so that the human is a being with God. That is our identity. That is our meaning. That is our sense of what it means to be persons. The final chapter then, chapter 7, some socio-cultural implications of the biblical understanding of meaning, is to understand that all of our life is in the encounter of being known, knowing and being known in a world, both with other humans, but also with God, and even the world itself. The word analysis, he says, comes from this breaking up, breaking things apart, breaking. So it's still my wonder about analytic theology. It's like you're breaking everything apart. From where are you breaking it, and to what goal are you breaking it apart? And if it just ends up in parts, then it's like getting a new dog and cutting up into pieces just to see what it's made of. You don't have much of the dog left. So the whole nature then of seeing that there's this whole, and this is where it brings Polanyi in, that the social implications is we indwell reality with other humans, with the world that's around us, that God creates and sustains, and to use Bart's concept, accompanies us every day, every moment. We are not alone. You are not alone. He will always be with you. And that even in the world that can't speak, and this is T.F. Torrance's idea also, we are priests of creation. We find language as scientists, talk about the nature of the world and to care for it and to describe well that we might be caregivers for ourselves and for others and for our children and our grandchildren and beyond that. So our voice on behalf of the voiceless becomes part of the hearing of God, including breaking chairs sometimes to get to what it is we need. Some things need to be broken because they're getting in the way of what it would look like to really live in this indwelt space. And that we acknowledge the personalness of others and give voice to every aspect of those beings. So the sacredness of being is to see this world contingent on God's action and to live seeing it as valued, cherished, honored by him, and that in all that we do, we are corresponding in that with what it is that God is saying and doing, being. And so 7.3, man with the community of beings. God made humans to be with others, being in communion. I mean, I think that's the point of the book. We're not self-contained, and the journey into self, to think, comes back to the other. John McMurray calls this the rhythm of withdrawal and return. Yeah, you're going to go out and do things, and you come back and say, hey, you'll never guess what I experienced today or who I saw in the sharing of life. You know, this was my high point, this was my low point. In the knowing of one another, there is the coming together, which I had a client yesterday say, my wife and I are working on building intimacy, and so we're working on doing recreation together. And it's like, so recreation's good, but are you just hiking together? Is there something more there? What would it look like to talk about what you're afraid of and what you're looking forward to? What would it look like to begin to talk about the experience? Like, oh, that's a good idea. It's like, yeah, that's the intimacy part. That's the knowing and being known part, right? So the whole nature of how we even engage, what does it look like to become intimate with one another? That is part of this whole valuing of the meaningful acts towards one another so that we have an integrated life. That was his word, the integrated life. The interpenetration of our being as a web of relatedness. This is all in 7.3. No one is complete in themselves. We exist in open systems and become ourselves in communion with others. And again, the point of the church and what is it that we're organizing for? The lecture and all that is somewhat problematic if you, after 20 years, say, so do you know this person? Well, I know who they are and what they do. I'm not really sure that I know that much about them. Do you know how they feel about you? I have no idea. They smile at me, they shake my hand, they must like me. That's it. We might be missing something here. The ontological ground of reality is a community of self-love and mutual love. Final point, the vision of integrated culture based on the reality with God and the cosmos in intimate communion and lively interpenetration. There's this vision of the interdependence, using Bryden's term there, of knowing and being known in a unified reality as it reveals itself into being. And this is Torrance's kataphusin in with persons, that we know according to the nature of the other, we let them reveal himself to us. So that there's a reverence, a solidarity. These go to the depths of our being in God's world, and our scientific knowledge enhances our human communion with the world. That is the service of science within the purposes of God in an orderly world that he invites us to come and care for, to be stewards, to cement human relations in the covenant community rather than living the contractual society in a fractured world of individuals. Here ends the reading.
Thank you.
It was kind of a skimming, but I think sometimes it's good just to get the skim to, just hear the layers. We did a really fast skim in the beginning and a faster one. It is a great book. There are copies. If you go to bookfinder.com, I think there were 13 copies out there. They started about $40 a copy. So it's not super cheap, the cheapest ones. But anyway, it is a possible book to get. And I found it to be quite an interesting book for those who are interested in the world of why are we where we are and the problems that seem to be plaguing humanity at many levels at this point. So there are great
one final thing.
Yes, let's hear it.
Can I chip in something? Have you heard of the name Michael Poon?
Spell the last name.
P-O-O-N.
Well,
he's an Anglican retired theologian, originally from Hong Kong, did his DPhil at Oxford, and then established or helped to establish the Anglican theological community in Singapore. And if you go to Michael Poon and you go to the Singapore Archdiocese, they've got this Anglican theological center that is embracing Asian culture, that is embracing what could be an Anglican, new form of Anglicanism in the 21st century, because of the schisms that we're now kind of dealing with, which is very much Western and other. a majority world stuff.
Yeah.
And Michael Poon has been in Singapore for decades now. He's now retired. But what he has to say is extraordinary, and what that center has to say is extraordinary. So what this book by Carver, I've heard of his name before and stuff, by the way, has done for me is to see, well, have the Singaporeans done work in relation with Carver Wu?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll find out and do some posting. But that was one of the things that came to my mind very quickly as I prepared for today.
Yeah.
Michael Poon.
I appreciate that. And I think the whole nature of, these books are they were edited by T.F. Torrance. They're not specific to Torrance, but they really are opening up a broader conversation. And
Yes,
what you're doing
yeah.
there is just opening it up. It's like letting a good bottle of wine have a full breathing to get the full sense of what's there. So thank you for adding that. And I hope that we continue to introduce each other to things that are within the conversation that keep giving us insight for what it is that we might gain from it all. So thank you. Next week, we have a visitor. We have Lucas Stamps, who was the editor with Mike Hovitz on T.F. Torrance and Evangelical Theology, a Critical Analysis. So he was one of the editors, and he did part of the work in the introduction, all that. And so I wanted to invite him to come on and give us insight as to his background with Torrance, why he worked with Mike in doing this, and just what he learned from the process of bringing this book together as well. So if you glance at the book, if you have it, and think of questions to ask Lucas, my goal always in the first instance is just to get to know him. And what is it that he brings that we wouldn't have known if we didn't have him show up to tell his story as well. So that is the first agenda, but beyond that, to investigate as to, how he will add to our conversation and awareness of the people he knows that can add to the conversation as well. So
Great.
good. Well, thank you all
you.
for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good stuff, I think. And we'll keep plowing through. We have 4 more books to go through before we hit the end of the year. There are 5 books in another series that Torrance edited. He actually had done it before this one. I didn't discover until I started doing these, and I looked up. It was one of the authors does something in that other series as well. So we'll do 5 books next year in this other series that Torrance edited as well.
Okay.
Which
Marty,
one of those 5 is Torrance himself?
Say,
So,
Marty, you
Great.
got to get a chance to go join an ultimate team here this week and bring us back some experiential knowledge of the personal.
That sounds
we're
great.
gonna have Paul get his grandson on and tell us the story of what he does. So
Good stuff.
Yeah.
okay, friends.
Because it's a male and female thing that they play. It's amazing.
Yeah, great. Blessings on you all.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.